To say that my paper was stolen since this morning by Advocate Sekakani, in a big way by Nelvis Kakema, and just now by Lunga Mantashi. So I don't know what to do. So I'll just proceed, But before I go on, I just want to say that I want to talk about Marikana as a reflection that Marikana Massacre, for me, happens in the milieu of fake freedom and self-hate. And therefore, South Africa must fall and Azania must rise. However, I just want to make a few remarks or observations. I don't know how significant they will be. Comrade Nelvis, you talked about the 34 constitutional principles, and those are deadly principles. And somehow, 10 years later, we're talking about Marikana, we talk about 34 black people who were killed there. I don't know what to make of this, interpretation-wise. Perhaps I should take a more superstitious and spiritual, relation to this, to say today we are lamenting about the product of the 34 constitutional principles in the same vein as we're talking about the 34 black people who were killed in Marikana. The second observation I want to make is that when the symbol of colonialism, which is Queen Elizabeth, died recently, it took less than 4 hours for our President, Cyril Ramaphosa, and his government to issue a statement of condolence, registering their profound pain at the loss of the Queen, the dearest Queen. And recently, maybe 2 weeks ago or so, there were talks that there was an invitation from King Charles III to the president in his personal or familial capacity to visit the king. And immediately there are talks that that invitation was accepted. 10 years after Marikana, we are told, I don't know, that the president was supposed to go to Marikana to apologize or visit the widows of the Marikana victims. I don't know whether he's still going to go, but the apology was registered within 4 hours, and the invitation from King Charles has already been accepted. Anyway, Marikana, meaning the massacre, is a manifestation and a reminder of the lager. The Afrikaans people will know what I mean by the lager. And this lager is called South Africa, and which is a construction of colonization and apartheid, which is essentially an expression of white supremacy. So before we traverse this matter deeply, it needs to be emphasized that what happened in Marikana on the 16th of August 2012 was purely a criminal, racist, and anti-black act of cruelty and disrespect to the African people in their own land by forces hell-bent on profiteering with the help of non-white puppets of white supremacists in this so-called rainbow dispensation of the ANC. This is particularly so because all the victims of this dastardly act, the murdered and the injured, and all the natives of this land. What does that mean? It means that all the widows and orphans of Marikana are black. None whatsoever is from other races. So the post-1994 arrangement of the rainbow is nothing but the decorated lager of the Boers and all those who came to settle in this land since 1652. That is why it is still framed and referenced in the eyes and language of the settlers in South Africa. So the origin of South Africa, which is a geographical description of this land, is clearly a white construct. And our continued sustenance of this framing and naming points to our complicity or our vindication of the conquest or the onslaught. This aspect is premised on the historicity surrounding the construction of the meaning, which is a man-eating monster, which is called South Africa. Yes, this monster is sustained by the blood of African people, beginning with the wars of resistance, the displacements of black communities from their lands to make way for the mining industry, and the massacre in Sharpeville, for instance, in 1960, June 16 uprising Soweto, 1976, and through to Marikana. So the historical construction of South Africa is traceable to the creation of the Boers, that is the Afrikaners, after their adventure as they trekked inland, the concept of the voortrekkers, so to the Transvaal. And here they were resisting the British colonialists. So how did they try to resist this? By establishing their own Boer republic called the Republic of the Transvaal, which they also called, they said, Afrikaanse Republiek, which means the Republic of South Africa, in 1857. So which tells us that when you say South Africa, you are referring to the construct that was created by the Afrikaners in 1857. So the other name for the Republic of the Transvaal was the Republic of South Africa. So the British annexed this republic in 1877, but the Afrikaners won it back after defeating the British in 1881. We know that after the Anglo-Boer War in 1902, with the defeat of the Afrikaners or the Boers, the British and the Boers agreed to form a union of South Africa. Underline the word union as signifying the power of the British, as in my view, not your view, this was the creation of the Union Jack in the new configuration. So when the Afrikaners got back to power after 1948, they worked towards reviving their Boer Republic. So ultimately, they changed the Union of South Africa back to their Transvaal Republic, or the Republic of South Africa, on the 31st of May, 1961. So before the war, Paul Kruger had emerged as one of the presidents of that African Republic in 1883. So to date, his republic, what you call your country, still honors him with that huge park called the Kruger National Park, and his republic continues to defend and protect him denotatively and connotatively against the natives in the Central Business District of Pretoria and elsewhere in this country via the statues and the streets in Isona. In other words, this republic, your republic, continues to pay tribute to him. But we know he is the symbol of white or Afrikaner dominance, the symbol of the lager 28 years into the lie, which is called freedom in South Africa. So actually, this is not a lie, but a contradiction, because from a liberatory point of view, you cannot, in your sober state of mind, read the word freedom and South Africa in the same sentence. As I've said, South Africa connotes oppression The word South Africa connotes oppression and conquest of black people. So the so-called freedom we are intoxicated with in the last 28 years is therefore a fraud and a deep fake. It's a dummy that we've been sold all along since 1994. So the name South Africa is an expression of marginalization of black people by settlers in their own land. So it conjures images of slavery where blacks are deemed to be subhuman, if not non-human. I cannot belabor this point because Frantz Fanon and Steve Biko have dealt with this matter extensively. This lager, which you call South Africa, further connotes a milieu where the condemned, the oppressed, and the dispossessed black masses are characterized by disunity and self-hate. At the core of this disunity and self-hate is, of course, mental slavery, which breeds inferiority complex and thus entrenches notions of self-hate. One of the critical aspects which even the likes of Biko, Amilcar Cabral, and Fanon pointed out in the description of a conquered people, and of course centered on mental colonization, is how oppressed people participate or are even complicit in their own oppression and annihilation in this lager. Blacks are economically excluded and thus live in treacherous milieu of poverty, landlessness, exploitation, disease, crime, grime, cultural domination, and indeed death itself. And it is in this sense that we must start thinking about service delivery movements, which other people call political parties, and liberation movements. So as long as we have service delivery movements, we'll continue to experience these issues of inequality. So the opposite of all these debilitating elements applies to other races, particularly white settlers in this lager or Boere Republic, which we call South Africa. So my submission is that the Marikana experience should be interpreted in this way. That is, these are the kind of things we should expect in a lager or a Boere Republic. Thus, as long as you have the lager, you should expect all the debilitating aspects that I have alluded to, including Marikana. Having said all these points, one cannot escape the relevance or irrelevance of the South African Constitution. In other words, the law in this country post-1994. What the post-1994 dispensation or arrangement has done is to tinker with the lager, or indeed do serious cosmetic work on the lager by papering over the ugly anti-black cracks with the rhetoric and lies of freedom and human rights. We know that rhetoric is not reality. In fact, the Constitution is one of the most dangerous documents in modern times, which for me is like a submarine that torpedoes the interests of the natives in a subtle way. We need to admit that white people outsmarted the ANC at the CODESA negotiation table to ensure that the apartheid status quo, that is the lager or South Africa, remained intact. That is why Comrade Nelvis was talking about we have the ruling party which thinks that it is the ruling class. That's the point. So, in other ways, the 1994 settlement did not result in the transfer of power from white people. And the ANC leadership know this. That is why to date, they wear caps or merchandise inscribed with slogans of "Aluta Continua." And also these are reminiscent of that phraseology that they use, the fact that they talk about the second phase or the phase of the second transition and blah, blah, blah. So that is an element of indictment and admission. So that is why the ANC today is still in alliance. SACP, COSATU, and SANCO. But you have to understand, why do you need an alliance when you are in power? So the logic or illogic of this issue of alliance is that you need an alliance to fight an enemy. So if you're in power, why do you need an alliance? Perhaps Comrade Nelvis Alzapo may need alliance, because Alzapo has never lied to itself that it's in power. So whilst on this, I need to comment on this balance that black people in South Africa got political power and still need to fight for economic power. In my view, this logic or illogic is fashionably misplaced. It's so uncritical, really, and actually very, very shallow. We got political power, now we want economic power. I think that is nonsense, honestly. Power is power. It is a totality of various aspects endowed onto a people, including their history, their identity, language, culture, epistemology, or knowledge systems, and of course, political and economic power. Therefore, a people without economic power cannot, for instance, assert their political ideology, their education system, their linguistic prowess, and cultural relevance. And in essence, I want to say power is power. And when a people is in power, there is no need to truncate or break it down into discrete units. I am actually forever tempted to refer to Dante Alighieri. His powerful position is that, and I quote, "The power of power lies in its ability to hide its mechanisms of oppression." And I quote. In other words, white people are in power even if we are in the so-called post-1994 democracy, but you don't actually see, it's hidden. So they are in power, although you may lie to yourself that you are in power, whereas the real power is in the hands of white people. So the power of power lies in its ability to hide its mechanisms of oppression. So looking at the post-1994 dispensation in this country, in the context of Alighieri, it is evident that white people, I repeat, white people are very much in power. So, Africa, when you utter the phrase or the name South Africa, you are entrenching the reality that we are still in the lager. By the way, South Africa in isiZulu is Mzansi Africa, which some excited people colloquially refer to as Mzansi. So analytically, when you say Mzansi, you are not being progressive or revolutionary, because you are still saying South Africa, except that you are doing it in isiZulu. Just like those people who think they are decolonizing the landscape of this country by calling the Northwest Province Bokoni Bophirima. This concern is extended to even the singing of the stem in our so-called national anthem. There is nothing, listen gentlemen, there is nothing as heartbreaking as watching a former freedom fighter, a former guerrilla, or even the victims of apartheid brutalities singing the stem. That's very, very heartbreaking. I shudder to even imagine Vuisile Mini, Steve Biko, Onkgopotse Tiro, Mapetla Mohapi, Robert Sobukwe, Chris Ani, Tsitsi Mashinini, or even Solomon Matlango singing this stem. Just to imagine that. But however, I have no doubt that Steve Biko would have refused to sing this theme because singing it would have defiled him and distorted his character. I'm confident about what I'm saying because this is the man who said, and I want to quote, "I'm going to be me as I am, and you can beat me or jail me or even kill me, but I'm not going to be what you want me to be." And I close the quote. So there's no way in which somebody who has uttered these words would have come to a point where he would sing this theme, gleefully so. So I want to come to the logic of Black Economic Empowerment, BEE, which touches on the issue of the centrality of economics in the struggle or even in oppression. I think, actually I hereby state that BEE is another form of self-indictment and the confirmation that the 1994 settlement did not collapse the lager. It did not conquer apartheid. BEE is a farce or a painful joke in South Africa because it is a lamentable oxymoron that exposes the reality that the minority, which is white people, are expected to empower the majority, that is, the natives of this land. So what BEE does or has done has been to effectively invite a few blacks to the white man's economic table to be allocated crumbs and thereby silence the liberatory aspirations of the oppressed masses. By the way, the ideals of the liberation struggle were not about the selection of certain individuals to be given shares in white businesses. So, this invokes the critical question of the role of black partners in the BEE companies, for instance, in Marikana and other experiences. It questions the role of the black people who are participating in Loanmain, for instance. So all this happened because the lager was cosmetically locked by the 34 constitutional principles. It was locked and draped in the colors of the rainbow at CODESA. But it remains the lager still. How this happened is of most relevance to a conference of this nature because at the center of this locking up affair is the Constitution of South Africa. So, in my view, this constitution of yours stands accused. So, a sophisticated anti-black document that protects and or guarantees white people their ill-gotten gains is what we refer to as the best constitution. As I've said earlier, it is important to remind ourselves about what the liberation project or mission was about. What the Constitution gives to the oppressed people is human rights and not liberation. Which brings me back to the issue of not confusing service delivery and being a revolutionary act. By the way, black people in some homelands in pre-1994 South Africa had good service delivery projects, but they were not free. So like those people who are talking well about, Mangope, that he did this. Yes, you had tar road, you had water, you had it, but you were not free, you were not liberated. So I think we need to be very, very clear about this thing, that human rights or even service delivery does not amount to liberation. So this constitution does not guarantee the reversal of land dispossession and cultural conquest of African people. Instead, it guarantees the retention of the stolen land and cultural dominance to white people. I look at section 25, for the land question, and even section 30 for the cultural dominance or castration should serve as good examples to buttress this point. So the Marikana Massacre has further indicated how anti-black the rainbow dispensation is or has been. You just have to look at who was killed in Marikana. And actually it's even 10 years since that evil act, But there is arguably no sense of revulsion or even anger because, as I've said, it's black people who were ruthlessly murdered there. The reality that an ostensibly black regime, that is the ANC government, killed the black people in Marikana speaks to this dimension of self-hate and complicity. Furthermore, the ANC members and supporters effectively rewarded the people who are alleged to have conspired or orchestrated the massacre. Some of these were voted predominantly into powerful positions in society by the very same black people. So the Bikos and the Cabrals were unfortunately correct in their analysis of the existential question of the black condition. I have said elsewhere that, and I want to quote, in this academic space, I don't know whether it is scholarly for someone to quote, oneself. Let me do that. So I said in August, just 2 or 3 months ago, that, and I quote, 10 years later, the victims who are essentially the wretched of the earth, as we reference Fanon, are yet to see justice, while those responsible for or alleged to have colluded to the orchestration of this dastardly act still roam free and nestled in privilege. Close quote of myself. It is important at this stage to highlight issues of identity, pride, and dignity as markers of freedom and liberation. Of course, the issue of land and spirituality is a critically powerful indicator in this regard. However, it is a foolish situation that eats away the dignity and pride of a people if they are referenced through other people's markers of identity. That is why the issue of naming is most relevant when dealing with markers of revolution and liberation. The name South Africa, even at the denotative level, is a highly problematic concept, hence the position that black people maintained during the freedom struggle to have Azania as the name to be adopted for this country upon liberation. Nelvis, I'm not surprised that we don't have the name Azania because we haven't gotten liberation. So when we get liberation, I'm convinced that South Africa will fall and Azania will rise. Additionally, the powerfully clear message or meaning of the name Azania will not be something that the settlers would be comfortable with. So we mustn't be surprised that, the ruling class is not keen on doing what we thought would happen to rename this country to Azania. And I don't want to get into the mental gymnastics about the name Azania, what it means and why it and all that. If during the engagement or question and answer time, there are people with such, I'm very fortunate that in this session I have the custodians of this name, Nelvis Takema and Lunga. They're from the Azanian bloc. So one from the Azanian People's Organization and another one from the Pan-Africanist Congress of Azania. So I'm not going to get into that space should there be such questions around the name, but I like it. So, and because the Lager was not dismantled in 1994, the ANC government does not have the gumption to rename this country because they are not in power, but in political office. So, ladies and gentlemen, all this point to the absence of black sovereignty and self-determination in the 25 years of the ANC government. In any case, the fundamental question is, what can one expect in a South Africa? I think I've already answered that question. On the flip side, we should know that there are certain good things, actually there are only good things that you should expect from Azania. In fact, the opposite of what is happening in a South Africa should be found in Azania. This therefore asserts the thesis of why South Africa must fall. The most pertinent step, therefore, is to break the lock that locked the Lager at Codesa in 1994, which lock, in my view, is the South African Constitution, which came via the 34 constitutional principles. Attached to this is the ideological position or lack of revolutionary consciousness of the political leadership in the last 28 years in South Africa for denying us of our Azania. So I therefore submit that the people of this country need a genuine, resolute step, not an imbizo, in terms of which this imposed and elitist colonial constitution of South Africa is reviewed and infused with the tenets of the liberation ideals that speak to black people's aspirations. We need a black consciousness and Africanist constitution that will enable us to realize our Azania. The South African constitution must fall, and in its place or ashes must arise the constitution of Azania. This also suggests that the Boer Republic mentality or the mental construct that we have in this sense must be erased from our post-1994 leaders, especially from the perspective of electoral politics. This is important, Program Director, as I am nearing the conclusion. This is important because it is the leaders that have caused it up to the anti-black and neoliberal policies and frameworks which need to be obliterated. This will make it possible for the land to be returned to the natives. And the only way to repossess it from the settlers, whose forays are a matter of a historical record, should be entertained. But the Freedom Charter, Comrade Lunga, you said freedom cheater. All of the above. So, but the Freedom Charter cheater says the land must be returned. But the Freedom Charter cheater does not say that the land must be returned to its rightful owners, but rather be shared with those who stole it by crooked and cruel means. So the Constitution of South Africa is even outrageous in this regard, as it shields those who stole it via Section 25 and state that those who stole it may still sell it as per the market value if they so wish. So black people need to develop the culture and instinct of speaking and listening to each other. Frontally, they need to be cautious of anti-black forces that are properly marshaled in the form of NGOs and the so-called foundations. Instead of listening to these forces, black people should listen to the voices of liberation heroes, even those that came before 1912, including the kings and queens who fought in the wars of dispossession. The message of black solidarity and African unity, which the Black Consciousness Movement and Pan-Africanism respectively pivoted, should be re-centered in the communities of the oppressed people. This is because true reversal of what one we can say is the ingredient that prop up the lager of a South Africa. So, as long as we don't have this reversal, we'll continue to experience the lager or the South Africa. Coming back to this theme, I think it's the national anthem that does huge damage to the psyche of black people as it serves to entrench the sustenance of the lager. Program Director, I can see you are impatient, and I agree with you. So let me do this. In assessing what I've presented, ladies and gentlemen, I want to just mention one or 2 points, which if I don't do, I'll regret. It's very, very important. The first point is that we unfortunately don't want to associate with or simply scared to affiliate to the agenda of ensuring that Azania rises. Number 2, the late Brayo Masekela observed in 2015 that, and I want to quote him, that we have lost our sense of outrage. Indeed, we have lost our sense of anger, and therefore an assessment of how as black people have responded to the Marikana Massacre confirms this pathetic state of affairs. Another point is that in our various spaces as the oppressed, we have proven to specialize in cowardice, in divisions, in the form of black-on-black aggression. and also the unsolicited reconciliation and sleeping with the enemy. Then the other point, Program Director, is that we have a very, very astounding sense of self-hate. That is why some in our communities, black leaders, did not want us to talk about Marikana Massacre, but talk about only Marikana tragedy. So the oppressor or the oppressive class will never respect black lives for as long as we continue to show disdain and hate of our own. So the politics and culture of the stomach is highly problematic, and it does not bode well for our liberation project. So the fact that we are still seized with the lager 28 years on, and that the post-1994 government of the ANC has been reticent or failed or even scared to do even the easiest things, such as removing the stem or changing the name South Africa, for example, makes one wonder whether this government will ever touch the harder issues that affect the real interests of white people, such as the repossession of the land, the nationalization of the mines, and so forth and so forth. This is why I have problematized this stupid American-inspired notion in higher education called transformative constitutionalism when we talk about curriculum transformation. So importantly, ladies and gentlemen, this Freedom Charter-inspired constitution is not an ideal tool to be used to unleash a proper revolutionary agenda of black liberation towards the realization of Azania. Therefore, let me conclude by saying South Africa must fall and Azania must rise. Thank you.